Welcome on back, everybody, to the All Aussie Rules YouTube channel. This is a mid-season review time, and today we have the Geelong Cats that we will be looking at. As with each and every episode of these mid-season reviews, we'll have a look at their season so far, we'll look at how their players are going, we'll then have a look at what they've got to come for the rest of 2024 and what we expect for the remaining part of their season. Before we jump into it, as always, don't forget the regular podcast episodes go live on YouTube and Spotify. At the start of the week, we have a review of the previous round that goes live every Monday, and the preview of the next round goes live every Friday. Also, don't forget to check out the socials. We have Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook as always. Also, we've got some extra videos coming up this week, obviously, with the mid-season reviews. So check out the schedule on your screens right now, but I'll quickly run through it. Obviously, the review episode of Round 13 has already gone live. That went out on Monday night. Tuesday, we had Carlton and Essendon mid-season reviews go out on YouTube. Wednesday, which is this one right now, is the Geelong one. Later on today, we'll have Melbourne going live. And then on Thursday, we'll have West Coast and Gold Coast mid-season reviews going out. And then on Friday, we will have the Round 14 preview episode, as I mentioned, on Spotify and YouTube. So check out all of that content, plenty to come. And also don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. But no more fluffing about. Let's jump straight into Geelong's season so far. As most people probably know, they started really well. Their season got off to a flyer, and since then it's kind of fallen away. But let's go match by match. Obviously, opening round they had the bye, so their first game of the season was round 1 against Geelong. They are Geelong. Against St Kilda, down at the Cattery, and it was a close game. They kicked poorly, 10 goals 16, but they won by 8 points. They did most of that in the first half. They were 13 points up at half time. They lost both the third and fourth quarters, but held on for the victory against St Kilda. Round 2 was over at Adelaide Oval. They played Adelaide. This was a Friday night game, and they won comfortably, but Adelaide was struggling early season. They still kind of struggle for some games now, but they won that by 19 points, which they were leading by at quarter time. So solid start to their season. 2 wins, 2 games. They then played Hawthorn. This was the Easter Monday game. It was a weird sort of game. They dominated the first quarter, won it by 36 points. Then the second quarter they lost by 25 points. Third quarter they won by 25 points, and then the fourth quarter was a draw. So they end up winning by 6 goals, which is a solid performance. At the time, it looked pretty bad because Hawthorn hadn't shown much at this point, but Hawthorn's season has certainly turned around, and maybe it wasn't as bad that they got as close as they did. Round 4 was Gather Round. That was over at Adelaide Oval. They played the Bulldogs. This was one of the better games of the season so far for neutral supporters, I guess. Bit of an entertaining game. Geelong won it by 4 points. They looked like they were in control of the game most of the way. Bont and Lever dominated for the Bulldogs and nearly got them over the line, but didn't quite. So Geelong got their 4th win to start the season. They were flying. That continued the next week. They played the bottom of the ladder North Melbourne, who up until the weekend hadn't won a game. They now have. They won this with a massively high score. They kicked 21-13, 139. Obviously, North Melbourne were 75 points behind that, so it was a tough day for North Melbourne. Never looked in doubt for the Cats. Round 6, they went up to the Gabba for a wet and miserable game of football. Really low scoring. They won at 63. They kicked 9-9, 63. They won by 26 points. A lot of which was in the last quarter. They lost the first quarter by 4. They were 7 points up at 3-quarter time, and then outscored them by 19 points in the last quarter to win. semi-comfortably. It could have gone the other way if Brisbane turned up in the last quarter, but obviously they didn't, and Geelong got the win. Round 7, still undefeated for the Cats. Their season is cracking along at this point. Carlton at the MCG. They kicked 18-10, 118. Carlton obviously made it to 105 and kicked poorly in front of goal, especially early did the Blues, which probably cost them this game. At quarter time, Carlton had more opportunities, I think, than Geelong. Certainly felt that way to me. But Geelong just kicked straight and got away a little bit. Carlton came back multiple times, looked like they were going to win, but Geelong just kept holding on, and in the end won by 13 points in a good game. That was actually another very good game to watch. Carlton obviously shot themselves in the foot a little bit, which kind of cost them, but that's football. Round 8, the 7-0 Geelong Cats finally went down. This one to Melbourne at the MCG. Saturday night game. It was a weird sort of game, pretty low scoring. Geelong kicked 9-12-66, so some inaccurate kicking certainly didn't help them in this one. Melbourne, at this point in time, were probably playing their best footy of the year. They had won quite a few games. They were looking good. It's kind of dropped off since then, but at this point they were looking all right, and everyone was like, oh, well, it's just one loss for Geelong, it's fine. They were 7-0 up to that, so one loss isn't going to hurt them. Then round 9 came along, and they hosted Port Adelaide down at the Cattery, and things got worse for them. This was on Friday night. They were down by 5 goals basically at quarter time, 29 points down, in a really massively high scoring first quarter. It was 21 to 50, I think, at quarter time. It got worse in the second quarter. They only managed 15, while Port Adelaide managed 4 goals. So they were down 41 points at half time, and it looked pretty dire for them, but they did fight back in the second half. They got right back within a kick, ended up losing by said kick. Arguably should have potentially had a goal. Advantage wasn't paid to them, and they went back and missed it. So not a great performance, but at least a good second half showing from them. At least showed something. Round 10, they went up to Darwin and played Gold Coast, and this is probably their worst performance of the year. I think comfortably their worst performance of the year. They never looked in this game. They lost by 64 points and conceded 154, which, if you want to win games, you can't concede that many. So they scored 90, which is still a pretty solid offensive game from Geelong. They just could not stop the run and scoring ability of Gold Coast that day. High scoring first quarter, then they struggled in the second. They did all right in the where are we? Yeah, the third they were terrible, and then the fourth they were high scoring again and finished okay. But they comfortably lost this one. They never really looked in it after about quarter time. So 3 losses in a row, and then they had GWS at home, and this is another one that you look at it and you're like, what are they doing? Because GWS was struggling as well at this point. They had a home game, kicked 11-8-74 and lost by 4 after a really good first quarter, where they were plus 14 points at quarter time. They then had a terrible second quarter where GWS went straight past them. Third and fourth quarter they fought back, but it was too little too late. They lost in another close one. So 3 out of their 4 losses had been by under 10 points. So it's not terrible 4-week stretch from them, but on their record went 0-4. So in that regard, it isn't great. They then got another game at the Cattery the next week. This one against the Tigers, and luckily, well, maybe not luckily, but certainly much needed was a victory for them, and they got it by 5 goals after trailing by 16 points at half time. They turned it on in the second half and kind of ran away with it a little bit. Richmond obviously have not had a great season, but they have shown a little bit of life over the last 3 weeks. So they did what they needed to Geelong to get the 30-point victory here. Round 13, they played Sydney Swans up at the SCG. This obviously was just on the weekend been. And they started absolutely cracking. They kicked 5 goals in the first quarter. Sydney kicked 0. But after that, it was kind of a one-way traffic in the way of Sydney, and Sydney overran them, which, I mean, it was to be expected. Sydney have only lost 1 game this year. They've been dominant and are very, very good at the SCG. But just shows that probably Geelong are a little bit off them at the moment. They lost by 5 goals. So after a 7-0 start to the season, they've obviously dropped 5 out of their last 6. So they're still in a point where they're comfortably in the top 8, or not comfortably as such, but in the top 8. But their season is potentially looking like it could get away from them very quickly if they don't turn their form around heading into the next bank of games. Before we have a look at said games, we'll have a look at some of their stats throughout the season. Their first quarters are typically very good. They've won 9 out of 13, so 9 and 4 in first quarters is a pretty handy result. Second quarters, they started the season okay. In the second quarters, they won 5 out of their first 7, but then since then they haven't won another one, so they've lost their last 6. So second quarters aren't great. First quarters kind of similar. The first 7 weeks when they were winning games, they won first halves every time. Since then, they've only managed to win one first half in the last 6 weeks. Third quarters are probably almost their best quarter in terms of record. They're once again 9 and 4. Plus 4 points per third quarter. So they're very good at third quarters. And then fourth quarters, they're not terrible. Once again, 7 wins, 5 losses and a draw. So they're solid in pretty much every quarter. Second quarters are probably clearly their worst. They're minus 6 points per game in the second quarter, and have lost their last 6. So that's probably the main area they need to turn around in terms of which part of the game they're struggling the most in. But yeah, overall, first and third quarters are their best, then fourth, then second. Disposals, they're not a high disposal team comparatively compared to their opposition. Most weeks, overall, they're minus 18 disposals per game. They're mainly a kick team, which tends to be what most teams that don't over-possess it are, but they just don't have any accumulators, really. They're a team that kind of just go for it. They try to run through the middle or even down the wings, but they just try and run the ball, get the ball, kick the ball long, move the ball forward and try and convert that way. Inside 50s, they're slightly up for the year, plus 1.15. Some huge discrepancies in inside 50 counts throughout the season, really. They have some games where they win the inside 50 count by quite a while, and then there's other weeks where they lose it by quite a margin. So it equates to them being up overall in inside 50s, but so like round 1 against St Kilda, plus 19, they won that game. The next week they were minus 13, they lost. They won that game. The week after they were minus 9, and they won that game. North Melbourne, they dominated it. Carlton, they got smacked by 21 in inside 50s and yet won the game. And then other ones like GWS, they were plus 15 and they lost that game. So the inside 50 count doesn't matter too much in their games. It's more about being efficient and converting your opportunities. Disposal efficiency, they're one of the lower ranked teams in terms of comparatively towards their opposition, which is how I keep track of disposal efficiency, just because each game is kind of different. Like wet games are obviously going to be a lot lower. They played the game against Brisbane in the wet, so that was obviously going to be a lot lower than most. in terms of disposal efficiency. I think the Port Adelaide one also was pretty slippery, so that was pretty low. Gold Coast obviously up in Darwin. That's the Darwin games are always a bit lower just due to the slick conditions, but comparatively they typically have a lower disposal efficiency than their opponents. None more so than the game in Gold Coast where they were not minus 9.7, so they just didn't turn up to those conditions up in Darwin that day. Forward efficiency, there's been a couple weeks where they really showed their dominance in this area, mainly North Melbourne and Carlton games around 5 and 7. They were really good. Since then they've kind of dropped off a little bit. They had a bad week against GWS. They haven't really shown a high number recently. Sydney on the weekend they were okay in this regard. Defensively they weren't great, but that's they showed an improved performance at least on the weekend in that regard. Clearances, another area where they just get dominated at week in, week out. They've only managed to win the clearance count 3 times this year. One of them against North Melbourne, very inexperienced midfield. Second one was against Gold Coast, who that's a little bit surprising to be honest that they did manage to win the clearance count that day, seeing they're not the best. And third one was against Richmond, who obviously have had a lot of injuries, just aren't travelling the greatest. So not the most fantastic record in terms of clearances for them. That goes for centre clearances and stoppage clearances. They're probably worse at stoppage clearances than centre clearances, but even their centre clearance game isn't great. They've managed to win the centre clearances 4 weeks, which was St Kilda, North Melbourne, Brisbane and Richmond. Contested footy, again, they lose this most weeks. They've kind of shown that, well, at least in the first 7 weeks, they showed that it didn't really matter, that you're losing some of these key areas of games, but whether that's the reason their season's kind of dropped off or not, I'm not 100% sure, but it certainly has dropped off. In the first 7 weeks when they had won 7 games, they only won the contested footy, one of them, and that was against North Melbourne. Once again, an inexperienced young team that you'd expect them to beat in contested footy. And then over the only other time they've really comfortably won the contested possession was against Richmond. So they certainly get beaten in that area most times. Uncontested footy, very similar. They did dominate Richmond at uncontested footy, but other than that, they kind of get bullied in the uncontested footy department. You look at games like the Port Adelaide one and the Gold Coast one, where they were minus 54 and minus 83. They kind of got smacked in that area. The one area that probably is most the biggest advantage that they have is their turnover game. It's clearly what they're best at. The first 5 weeks they won the turnover game each week. St Kilda they beat by 8, Adelaide by 7, Hawthorn by 3, Bulldogs by 10, North Melbourne by 20. So that's a really strong start to the year. They then failed the next 3 weeks to win the turnover game. They were against Brisbane, Carlton, Melbourne. They still managed to win 2 of those games, but they were only just losing the turnover game. So -3, -2, -3 aren't major differences in overall turnovers. And then since then, the last 5 weeks, they have won the turnover game again. They beat Port Adelaide by 5. They beat Gold Coast by 1. They beat GWS by 8. Richmond by 2. And Sydney by 3. So they are one of the best teams in the league in terms of turnovers comparatively to intercepts. So your turnovers compared to their turnovers. So that's probably a major reason why they started the season so hot, and their numbers have clearly dropped. So when after 7 weeks, they were averaging 6.1 turnovers more or less than their opposition, so plus 6.1, and then since then they've been only plus 2.6, so they're still above their opposition each week in terms of turnovers per game, but it has dropped by 4 per game, which is probably equates to about the drop off they've had in that time, at least in my opinion. Marks, they typically lose that, which you kind of understand when they don't have as much of the ball as their opposition. Tackle game, they're pretty good at it. You take out, they've been bad a couple weeks, so they got smacked in tackles by North Melbourne, but once again, they won that game comfortably, so you kind of ignore the tackle stat that day. They got beaten by 14 against Gold Coast and 20 by GWS. You take out those few and they're pretty consistent. Overall, they're slightly up on the tackle count for the year compared to their opposition, but it's not an area of their game that they're probably dominant at. They did have a really high number, obviously, against Hawthorn in round 3 when they had 90 tackles. That was one of the bigger tackling games of the year. And they also have an 86 against Richmond, which they were plus 24 that day, and an 85 against Brisbane, which was plus 12. Funny thing about all 3 of those games, they did manage to win them all. So maybe that's a key area that they could focus on a little bit more, is making sure that they get a high tackle number, because they're 3-0 when they get those really high tackle numbers. But what would I know? Moving on, have a look at some of the players for Geelong this year, and who's been good and who's been not so much bad. We don't really look at bad players here, but overall, they don't have any major standout players, I guess, for the year so far. Max Holmes has been great. Myers has been really good. I don't think he's been as good as he was last year, in my opinion. Tom Stewart's been really good in defence. His start to the season was great. He missed a couple weeks here and there, but he's been very good. Dangerfield's obviously been a key out for a fair chunk of this year. I think he's still only sitting on like 4 games. Jeremy Cameron, he's had a couple really good games. Like his round 4 and 5 were really good against the Bulldogs and North Melbourne. I think round 7 against Carlton, he was also very good. But then he's also had a few games where he's not quite as good. Overall, I just don't see many of Geelong's players having standout seasons. They're probably more of a team first mentality, in terms of they don't have anyone that really stars consistently. They all share it around a little bit. As we said, they don't have any high ball winners. So that's the kind of football they play, and that's how it works for them on the most part. They're still, what are they, 8 and 5, so their season's still going pretty well. Now we can quickly look at what they've got to come. So they've got the bye in round 14. They come out of that with round 15 game against Carlton. That'll be a massive game at the MCG. They then play the Bombers, so 2 big tough games to come out of the bye. They then play Hawthorn down at the Cattery, Collingwood at the MCG, Bulldogs at the Cattery, North Melbourne down in Hobart, Adelaide at the Cattery, Fremantle over in the West, St Kilda at Marvel Stadium, and then they finish their season back in Geelong against the West Coast Eagles. So it's a bit of an up and down, I guess, finish to their season. They play Carlton, Essendon, Collingwood, who are 3 of the top 5 teams. But then the only other top 8 team they play is Fremantle. They get a couple of the lower ranked teams in North Melbourne, Adelaide, West Coast, and St Kilda. So they certainly have their opportunities there. You'd expect that they're going to win probably 5 of those reasonably comfortably. You'd think Hawthorn's always a tough matchup for them, and Hawthorn are playing pretty good at the moment. So that might be tough, but you'd expect down at the Cattery they should beat the Bulldogs, but you can never know with the Bulldogs. They should beat Kangaroos, they should beat the Crows down at the Cattery, they should beat St Kilda, and they should beat West Coast. There's 5 wins. That gets them to 13 for the year. So then all of a sudden, if they win 2 or 3 out of the Carlton, Essendon, Collingwood, Fremantle games, all of a sudden they could get to maybe 15 wins and potentially make top 4. also could lose the Carlton, Essendon, Hawthorn games, maybe even Collingwood. If they only win one out of those four, they certainly put themselves under a bit of pressure coming home. But it's from round 19 onwards, it's probably the easiest run of any team in the AFL over that 6-week period. Yes, Freo over in Optus is a very tough assignment. Bulldogs can be really tough, but the rest of it doesn't look like it's much of a challenge compared to what it could be. But the next 4 games are all real tough ones, in my opinion. So, where do we see them? At their best, back to the start of the season. Top 4 potential. Current form, they missed the 8. What I expect them to do is probably end on 12 to 13 wins for the year, which will get them in the top 8, probably in the 5th or 6th. 6 or 7, sorry, is what I was trying to say. Will that be where they end? Who knows? They certainly need to turn their form around, because their last 5-6 weeks has been certainly under par for them. They certainly need to come out and win. They need to win 2 out of their next 4 to give themselves a really good platform going into those final 6 weeks, where they could quite easily win all 6 of them. They probably don't. They probably lose the Fremantle one, but it's still a good. If they win 2 of those, gives them a good platform going forward. They'll have 10 wins after round 18, so 10 and 7. With 6 games to go, 10 wins. They surely win 4 of those last 6, which would give them enough to comfortably make finals. You'd imagine 14 wins should be enough, surely, to make finals. So yeah, that's where I have the Cats based at the moment. They've started the season well, they've dropped off, but what we see from them for the rest of the year will certainly be interesting. As I said, they probably run home with quite a few wins, so I'd imagine they're probably going to be full of confidence and peaking at the right time, provided they can make finals, which you'd imagine they will with that run home. So that's everything I have for the Geelong Cats. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe to this YouTube channel, to my Spotify, to all my social medias. We're all Aussie rules on all of them. I appreciate you for tuning in. Don't forget that there'll be more episodes coming out this week. Plenty more mid-season reviews still to go. This is about the halfway mark of the teams. I think this is number 9, so we've still got another 7 to come. Oh no, another 9 to come out. Jeez, I know math real well. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next video.